Yes, this is All Saints' Day, and we do remember those who've passed before, gone before, multitudes who went before us, who rose up, did what they needed to do, so that we actually have shoulders to stand upon, and we definitely do that. Has it occurred to you, or maybe better said, when did it occur to you that one day you will be an ancestor? Okay, well, maybe the elders among us have thought about that, maybe some others of us, but one day we all will. And you are writing that right now. It's not something in the future. Caitlin Curtis, she is a citizen of the Potawatomi Nation. She's a poet, an author of this book. It's called Native: Identity, Belonging, and Rediscovering God. And in it, she describes an aha moment that she had while she was being photographed for a book release. So this is what she says. At one point, Amy, which was her photographer, asked a question about my children and my children's children, about what they might see when they look on my face, about how proud they are to call me kin. I heard that from you, Rossi. I realized that one day I'm going to be an ancestor. When I have passed on and my spirit is left to lead my children and their children, they will talk about me, about my legacy, about what I left undone and what I did to change things, end quote. Do we think like that? Like I said already, maybe the older ones among us do. Maybe some who have recently lost someone who is very important to them do. Maybe those who are really in touch with God in these thin spaces that you described, Annie, maybe we do. Caitlin Curtis is 34 years old, and this book was published 2 years ago. So already, as a young woman, she is poignantly aware of the impact that today has not only on her future, but on her legacy and on all those who are close to her. We tend to have this pragmatic, linear view, understanding life and death. First we're born, then we live a life, beginning with childhood, education, entering a profession, relationships, possibly children, aging, and then death. The unspoken terms that we have in our minds for those are birth, life, and death. So basically the beginning of a life, the span of years, and then the end of a life. We who believe in an afterlife would add eternity to that list. There are variables that impact all of these phases, of course, but ultimately, that's it. Jesus, whom we regard as defining our faith, was known for upsetting everything, quite literally. And he was known for redefining the categories that existed then and that still exist and will exist. Here are just two examples. One example was he overturned the ancient hierarchical idea that put women and children at the bottom rung of the ladder, if they even were on a rung. And another one was he challenged the strict religious rules of his day. Jesus basically said that a rule is put into place and it needs to work for you. You don't work for it. So in other words, if it doesn't add value to your well-being and spiritual connection with God, rethink it. Quite subtly, he also brought a radically different twist to these three things: birth, life, and death. Think about that text that Becky read. We encounter sickness, death, burial, resurrection. Wait, what? No, not that. No, it's birth, life, and death. Maybe prolonged sickness, followed by enormous grief by those who are left, and an afterlife for those who had passed. But basically, it's birth, life, death. That's what we believe. That's how it goes. I mean, it really feels like the end, doesn't it? When someone dies. But here, there's a disruption in this whole expected flow. Now, Jesus was one that valued and still values relationships. And here he has several exchanges with people that are dear to him. We didn't read the entire chapter simply because of time, but in that 11th chapter of the Gospel of John, he tells the story of Jesus engaging with the mourners. Now, Mary confronts him with a rather salty response. If you had been here, my brother would not have died. Jesus didn't retaliate. He doesn't defend his absence. He doesn't lecture her for her accusation. He asks to be shown to the tomb. This is important for us to remember. When we are thrashing around, railing against the death of a loved one or agonizing over that death, grieving that loss, Jesus will not lecture us on faith or propriety. He will go with us to that place of hurt. The simple question, where have you laid him, positions Jesus squarely into this story of life, decline, ultimately death, and then who knows? They knew Jesus could have prevented that death. They had seen that happen. But now it was final. It was finished. And it sure felt like the end. When Jesus arrives at the tomb, Martha cautions him, no, don't open that. Don't open that. He's been dead, and his body has already begun to decompose. It's the end. Don't you get that? Don't you feel that? But someone rolls that stone away, and incidentally, bodies were actually buried in caves in those days, and then stones were rolled over the entrance. When that tomb is open, Jesus prays, and then he calls out to the dead man. Prayer and action. When he combines prayer with action, that veil between life as we know it and death as we think we know it becomes very opaque. Jesus' action defies rationality. He calls out to dead people. Who does that? While the people of Jesus' day did have a religious worldview that included life and death with a resurrection at the close of history, Jesus shifts that concept onto center stage. Resurrection here. Resurrection unexpected. Resurrection not merely a nebulous concept for the afterlife. No, resurrection now. So Jesus, being Jesus, introduces a physical resurrection just to help them understand, and to help us understand, and to help us think much more broadly. This isn't an invitation for people to pray for those who have died to come back to life. No, it's an invitation to consider something that may be different than what we think it is, or what it looks or feels like. What did Jesus say? The one who believes in me will live even though they die? It's much bigger than what many Christians have made this statement to be throughout the millennia. It's not simply, believe as I do, believe in Jesus and you will go to heaven where no one dies. That is a limited view, which doesn't even begin to tap into the vastness of the divine. Could it be that birth, life, and death are simply finite terms that describe what we think happens on this planet? That description is valuable. It's important. It's accurate from our perspective, but it's also incomplete. I don't think anyone would argue with the fact, or at least the belief, that divine presence, that spark of life, has been here long before humans ever populated this planet Earth. When we dare entertain thoughts of the cosmos, its origins, the explosive expansion of it that continues to this day, our limited brains are quickly overloaded. But this exercise also invites us into the center of life. Life that doesn't begin or end. Life that is. Life that has meaning. Life that continues from one ancestor to another, one generation to another, one life cycle of plants and animals and civilizations to another. Jesus says, if you believe in me, in the Christ, in how this cosmos and all that it contains is set into motion, you will live, even if you die. Your spirit has its origins with God, with the dust of the stars. Your body houses similarities to all other elements and every form of life, and definitely with those who are in your ancestral lineage. This then helps us to understand how things never die, even though it sure feels like the end. When we begin to understand Jesus' actions at Lazarus' tomb, where he stood together with those mourners as a glimpse into a radically new view of life and death, this resurrection story makes so much more sense. The miracle becomes so much greater than simply a reversal of decomposing cells or breath coming back into collapsed lungs, or a reunification with loved ones. This event at the tomb now points to the reality that resurrection happens all around us, every day, to everyone and everything. Resurrection as transformation, it certainly was for Lazarus' body. But also think about the image we considered last week from John's 12th chapter. Unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains alone. Remember the phrase, anyone who holds to life as it is destroys that life? Ironically, hanging on to anyone or anything without the willingness to allow transformation or resurrection will ultimately lose that person or thing. What appears to be dead is actually waiting for resurrection. The kernel of wheat hidden in the ground, responding to moisture and warmth and the nutrients of the soil, becomes not another kernel, but a flourishing plant. When it feels like the end of something or the end of a life, resurrection is possible. Only then. We can likely grasp resurrection as transformation more easily than resurrection as transferal, unless we're scientists. In chemistry and physics, there is the law of the conservation of energy, which states that the total energy of an isolated system remains constant. So basically what that means is that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. Rather, it is only transformed and transferred from one form to another. Resurrection as transferal. Is this how we explain characteristics and genes having been passed along through the generations, many times from people we've never met and never spoken with? You may have inherited your great-grandmother's eyes, or your great-uncle's sense of humor, but you never met. How do you understand the power of prayer that has been prayed, prayers that have been prayed generations before you, but they still impact your life today? Can we prove this? Well, genetic traits, quite possibly. Spiritual influence? Probably not. But as people of faith, we are, by definition, called to trust what we do not see. By living out our faith in community, we hope We hope to bypass the radical outliers which take this way to the extreme, and such extremes are currently on display on the national platform. But we do trust things we cannot see. We all do it. Physically, intellectually, spiritually. Steve Thomason, artist, pastor, and professor of spiritual formation at Luther Seminary, poses this question. Is it possible that our ancient belief about the resurrection of the dead, as taught in Scripture, was a way to discuss the law of the conservation of energy in an age when humanity saw things differently? Is it possible? Indeed. On a practical level, the thought that our actions, our genetic makeup, our prayers can impact future generations is profound. And what Caitlin Curtis pondered when she said, "When I have passed on, and my spirit is left to my children and their children, will they talk about my legacy?" This possibility can lead us to live more intentionally, to pray with more consistency, and know that those who have passed on are still with us, their soul intertwined, interwoven with our souls. This will never change. Resurrection as transferal is worthy of consideration. The text from John 11 ends with a very unusual call, a call for a dead man to rise. Now you're standing at that tomb. The stone has been rolled away, and you're watching Jesus. You don't know what he's going to do. You're kind of clutching your robes and maybe holding your hand in front of your mouth, hardly daring to breathe, thinking, what's he going to do now? Well, let me remind you, Jesus was not afraid to be loud. Jesus was not shy about doing things differently. Jesus often had to stand alone for something because it was too out of the box for most people. Jesus was always about expanding people's perspective and giving them fresh insight and new hope. And he called a dead man out of the tomb. But more than that, he called his onlookers to reconsider their understanding of death and life. What does that mean for us? Well, one thing is that appearances and feelings sometimes are imposters. Not always, but sometimes. What seems lifeless may not be. And what feels like the end also may not be. Secondly, there is no judgment during a time where we wobble in between what we've always held as irrefutable and what comes out of nowhere as an invitation to think about something further. Jesus was a conversationalist. We will also hear his voice as we read stories such as these, and they come at us from an unexpected direction. And third of all, when it seems all within or around us is dead, call to it. See what new life will emerge from that apparently dead place. Resurrection allows us to summon life from a place of death. Expect it. Some form of transformation or transferal. Where do you feel as if it's the end? Is it a loved one who's gone? A distant dream that just isn't coming to pass? A structure that you've held onto for a long time and it just doesn't seem to work anymore? When it feels like the end of something or the end of a life, it really isn't because of resurrection. Resurrection is possible. To quote Steve Thomason again, what if the resurrection of the dead is the natural progression of our spiritual growth? Jesus said that until a seed falls to the ground and dies, it cannot grow to become something beyond itself. May we continue to consider that.